And on behalf of the Joan Shorenstein Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy in the Kennedy School, I want to welcome you tonight to the 5th annual presentation of the Goldsmith Awards. Berta Goldsmith, for whom these awards were named, lived her entire life in Philadelphia, and she died there in 1989 at the age of 97. A remarkable woman. She was a concert pianist and a medical technician, and she left most of her fortune to charities in those fields. But there was something else about her. She was also very interested in the power of good journalism and in the critical role that the press plays in a democratic society. She was a faithful follower of Washington Week and Review, Wall Street Week, and 60 Minutes. Visitors to her home were expected to uphold their end of a conversation about those news programs. Like other endowed lectureships and awards at the Kennedy School, the Goldsmith Awards acknowledge excellence, and in this case, excellence in investigative journalism and in research about government, politics, and the press. The Goldsmith Awards also reflect the Kennedy School tradition of bringing practitioners and scholars together. Tonight, we bring together outstanding investigative journalists and those who study the relationship between the press, politics, and public policy. It seems only natural that the Goldsmith Awards are administered through the school's Joan Shorenstein Center for Press, Politics, and Public Policy, for this center is dedicated to examining the intersection of theory and practice in these fields. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to the person who has developed and built the Joan Shorenstein Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy, the Edward R. Murrow Professor of Press and Politics, Marvin Kalb.
Thank you, Joe Nye. Thank you very much. This is, as you've all heard just now, the 5th time that the Goldsmith Awards have been given to young scholars, writers, and journalists who've been exploring the crucially important intersection of press, politics, and public policy. Exploring, as it's often described, the real world where theory is put into practice. None of these awards would have been possible without the exceptional contributions of 2 people, Berta Goldsmith and Robert Greenfield. Berta Goldsmith was a woman from Philadelphia who loved music and news. She played the piano when she asked visitors a lot of questions. What happened today? What does it mean? Who's telling the truth? Who's lying? She admired journalism that dug behind the obvious. Robert Greenfield, now retired, and is here tonight. Robert, why don't you stand up and let everybody see you, because you deserve an applause. Thank you. He was the Philadelphia lawyer who had been graduated from the Harvard Law School. He looked after her legal and financial affairs. And shortly after Miss Goldsmith died in 1989, Mr. Greenfield met Professor Gary Oren of our faculty, and an idea was hatched that in Miss Goldsmith's name, awards be given on an annual basis to scholars and journalists aimed at the rather simple proposition that while power can corrupt public officials, it can also provide the means by which public officials, kept to a high ethical standard, can help the people thrive in a democracy. The key is to cast the spotlight of inquiry into the complex corners of governance, a job for journalists and a job for scholars. As director of the Shorenstein Center, and I want to take a moment here to recognize Walter Shorenstein, who is here with us tonight as well. Walter, Doug Shorenstein, thank you. Thank you. I've been honored to run this extraordinary program from its inception. The Goldsmith Awards come in 4 parts. First, research awards, generally given to young scholars embarking on their careers. Second, the Goldsmith Book Prize, which our committee selects for that book which best explores the intersection of press, politics, and public policy. Now, this year, the committee has decided that there is no such book in 1996, and therefore no book prize will be given on this occasion. Third, the Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting, a $25,000 prize to the article or series of articles that, in the committee's judgment, represents the best example of investigative reporting into matters of public policy. And finally, the Goldsmith Career Award for Excellence in Journalism, given to the reporter who throughout his or her career has personified a strong commitment to the craft of journalism. Let us start with the Goldsmith Research Awards, and I've asked Frederick Schauer, the Frank Stanton Professor on the First Amendment, to present the awards. Professor Schauer will soon become the Academic Dean of the Kennedy School of Government. Fred?
Thank you. Thank you. With all due respect to our principal honoree tonight, she would have done just fine without this program. It is wonderful that the program is honoring her, but her career has existed, has taken place with great success without the program. Not so with respect to a large number of other scholars, researchers, and others for whom the support of a program like this is a necessary condition. And it is a credit to Marvin, to Robert Greenfield, to Gary Oren in the discussions that created this program in the first place, that they thought it so important that a significant part of the program was devoted to support of research, support of the kind of research that in the long run is likely to be very important in understanding the press and understanding the relationship between press and politics, but in the short run might not get the kind of support that it deserves. I'd like to announce now the winners of the Goldsmith Research Awards. One of the beauties of this program is that it supports scholars in a wide variety of different categories. Not substantive categories, which is true, but also categories of career, categories of status, and the like. And unlike previous years when I have divided this into areas of topics or topical interest, I'd like to divide it this year in terms of the categories of people who are being supported. Some of these people are here with us tonight. If you are here when I announce your name and topic, I hope you will stand up. I promise to be brief so you don't have to stand for too long. First, part of the program supports the research efforts of our own faculty, the faculty of the Kennedy School of Government. One of the awards this year goes to Professor Kerry Colanese of the Kennedy School of Government in conjunction with Margaret Howard of the University of Michigan, researching regulation and the coverage of the process of regulation in the news media. With respect to the categories that are to come, they are a bit larger. Please hold your applause until I have completed it. We also support research by faculty members at other universities and at other institutions, including this year, Susan Carroll of Rutgers University on print media coverage of the gender gap in the 1996 elections. Robert Friedenberg of Miami University in Ohio, the Communications Warriors, Political Consultants in Contemporary Elections. Susan Herbst of Northwestern University, Causal Models in the Public Sphere, How Legislators, Journalists, and Activists Reason About Politics. Nada Turkeldson of the University of California at Davis, The Media and Congressional Campaigns, examining coverage of African American candidates. The program also supports, fortunately and delightfully, our own students as well as our own faculty. This year, awards are going to Ivan Asher, a research assistant at the Kennedy School of Government, about to be a doctoral student at the University of California at Berkeley. From Russia with Skepticism, The Moscow Press and Russian Democracy, as well as Sharon Devereaux, who I believe is with us tonight, an MPP2 student doing research on youth and the media, seeing society, seeing the self. particularly significant part of the program is the support of doctoral research at other institutions. The program in the forthcoming year will be supporting the work of the following doctoral students working on their dissertation doctoral research: Mark Blythe of Columbia University, Monetarism Across Nations, Economic Ideologies and Political Change; Joanne Kavanaugh of Johns Hopkins University, The Cuban Council, a fledgling press challenges the politics of two nations; Chris Goodwin, who is here with us tonight from Brown University, Reassessing the Local News, an Empirical and Normative Analysis; Stephen Medvick of Purdue University, Is There a Spin Doctor in the House? The Impact of Political Consultants in Congressional Campaigns; Laurie Cox-Nyblom, who is here tonight, of the University of Southern California, Who Controls the Political Agenda, Presidential Rhetoric and Media Agenda Setting During the Kennedy, Nixon, Reagan, and Clinton Administrations; and James Snyder, Northwestern University, The Mass Media as Political Actors, the Case of the 1996 Telecommunications Act. It is tempting for those of us who are academics to think that the only research worth doing is in universities. However tempting that may be, it happens to be false. The Goldsmith program also supports practitioners and independent scholars who are doing important work even though they may not be connected with universities, including this year M.I. Elmaki of New Homeland magazine, doing research on privatization of the mass media in the Third World, and Steve Weinberg, a freelance writer, The Lessons of Ida Tarbell, What Journalists, Feminists, and Policymakers Can Learn by Studying the Life of History's Greatest Investigative Journalist. And finally, there is a quite delightful synergy between the Goldsmith program and the Fellows program of the Shorenstein Center. Three fellows of the Shorenstein Center are having their research supported in whole or in part by the Goldsmith program, including Steve Livingston of George Washington University, a fellow last year, clarifying the CNN effect, an examination of media effects according to type of military intervention. Nachman Shai, who is here in the fall, from Israel, writing on The Spokesman in the Crossfire, a decade of Israeli defense crises from an official spokesman's perspective. And finally, Richard Sobel, who is here with us tonight, who is doing research on portraying Bosnia opinion in the media. It is this is a remarkably rich and diverse program of research support. If we know more about the press and politics and the media in 10 years than we do now, as I am sure we will, we have this program to credit for a large part of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. That's great. As I mentioned before, there is to be no book prize this year, so we will skip ahead to the Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting, given each year at this time to enterprising and crusading journalism that promotes more effective government and higher ethical behavior on the part of government officials. The decision this year is made by a committee that reads and reviews and discusses all of these submissions. There's a widespread view that investigative journalism as a profession is in a state of sharp decline. People point to the recent ABC Food Lion case as an example that investigative journalism, at least as practiced by primetime news magazines, is in serious trouble, and the $5.5 million fine levied against ABC, which is now being appealed, will have a chilling effect on the production of other investigative pieces, and possibly so. But after reading all of the submissions this year, as I have in earlier years, I would say that investigative reporting is alive and well, thank you. Budgets may be tighter and ABC may become skittish in reporting on controversial issues, but there are still many journalists and many news organizations determined to engage in tough but fair investigative reporting. Most of these submissions were excellent, making it very difficult for the committee to reach a decision on which was the best submission, the winner of this $25,000 prize. The truth is, when you've read 70-odd submissions, you can narrow the field to, say, 30 without too much pain. But when you have to set a goal for yourself and then for the committee to get the number down to 10, the process of selection becomes extraordinarily difficult. And then when the goal is lowered still further to the final 5, the process becomes virtually impossible because one submission is almost as good as any other. This year we got down to the final 6. Magnificent reports and reporters, all of them. The 6 finalists for this year's Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting are somewhat in alphabetical order. When I call your name, please stand in place, and it will soon become clear that not all of the reporters from each organization are here. But starting with the Wall Street Journal, Jill Abramson, Helene Cooper, Phil Kuntz, Michael Moss, Glenn Simpson, Peter Waldman, and John Wilkie. From the Wall Street Journal, all of them reporting on the foreign contributions riddle. Chris Adams of the Times-Picayune, whose reports were called Of Pain and Gain. Glenn Bunting, Rich Connell, Maggie Farley, Sarah Fritz, Evelyn Iritani, Connie Kong, Jim Mann, Alan Miller, and Roan Tempest, the whole team for the Los Angeles Times, whose series was called Illegal Democratic Campaign Contributions. Elizabeth Marshak of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, who wrote FAA Safety Comes Second. Charles Sennett of the Boston Globe, whose investigation was called Armed for Profit, the Selling of U.S. Weapons. And finally, Joe Stevens of the Kansas City Star, who wrote Ill-Gotten Gains. These 6 finalists all wrote powerful pieces, excellent examples, but only one can win. And we have selected the 9-person team for the Los Angeles Times, represented by 2 members of the team of reporters, Glenn Bunting and Alan Miller. Would you both come forward? Both of you like to say something? You're entitled to.
Thank you very much. This is the second piece of great news here this evening. The first was seeing Glenn Simpson of the Wall Street Journal here, so we know that he's not back in Washington chasing the story while we're here. Nearly 8 years ago, when I first went to Washington, the Times editor, Shelby Coffey, gave me some parting advice. He said, "Follow the money," echoing the words of that most famous anonymous of Washington sources. That's both harder and easier to do now, with both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue awash in campaign cash. Hence, we find ourselves chasing the biggest campaign scandal story since Watergate, with no end in sight. This has been very much a team effort, with reporters and editors from across different sections of the Los Angeles Times collaborating, something that is not always easy to put together. Would like to single out a few individuals. It's always risky to praise editors because it just might encourage them. But I do want to say that from the very beginning, Tom McCarthy and Joel Haverman in the Times Washington Bureau were with us from early morning until late at night, often into the next morning, and did an outstanding job. I'd also like to say that Glenn Bunting has been an extraordinary partner as we pursued this, our most challenging and demanding and exhilarating of stories. Finally, in this age particularly, where tabloid journalism is proliferating, I want to say how gratifying it is to have the opportunity to pursue this kind of serious and substantial and consequential story. And I want to thank the Shorenstein Center and the Kennedy School for encouraging this kind of work and for so generously honoring us here tonight. Thank you.
Take away, hang around, hang around. I would also now like to ask the other finalists to please come up. We like to give you a token of our esteem as well. Could you please come up? Those I called the Wall Street Journal, Phil Kuntz, Glenn Simpson, the Times-Picayune, Chris Adams, Cleveland Plain Dealer, Elizabeth Marshak, Boston Globe, Charles Sennett, the Kansas City Star, Joe Stevens. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the recipient of the Goldsmith Career Award for Excellence in Journalism. I must confess that I toyed briefly with the notion of beginning this introduction by saying this is a person who needs no introduction. But I, too, used to work in television news, and I didn't want to yield the microphone that easily. I wanted to say something about Barbara Walters because she is very special in the world of broadcast news, and she is very special for a number of reasons. First, Walters has been a pioneer in that world. There has been so much radical change in recent years that many of us tend to forget that she was the first woman to host the Today Show on NBC, and she was the first woman to co-host an evening news program. She worked for the Today Show for 15 years, longer than any other woman. Bryant Gumbel recently reached that landmark of 15 years too. Walters started in 1961 as a researcher, then a writer, moving on to becoming an on-air reporter, quaintly dubbed the Today Girl. And finally, Walters, already a budding star on TV, was named co-host of the program. She probably could have remained co-host, but in 1976 she jumped ship, an act that transformed the TV news business, though it might not have been apparent at the time. And she joined ABC to co-anchor a network news misadventure called the ABC Evening News with Harry Reasoner and Barbara Walters. The pairing of Reasoner and Walters was soon discovered to be an utter calamity. Critics said they represented a light news reach for ratings that flopped. Harry and I were mismatched, misguided, and so painfully uncomfortable together. So Walters herself recalled many years later, referring to her early years at ABC as tumultuous and sometimes terrible. She suffered many slings and arrows of outraged masculine vanity. The legendary Fred Friendly of CBS looked at the Reasoner-Walters show and pronounced, "This isn't journalism, this is a minstrel show." Whatever she was judged to be at this stage of her career, Walters was undeniably the first woman to reach the top, and the men so comfortably ensconced in their traditional roles as anchors, pundits, and presidents proved to be less than gracious colleagues. At that time, Reasoner literally squirmed when he was seated next to her. And even more recently, Peter Jennings seemed itchy as well, brushing her comments aside during the O.J. Simpson coverage as if they were really not worth listening to. Jennings on air put her down several times, it appeared. Walters told the Washington Post last year, "He may have been dismissive to me, because he didn't perhaps take me seriously enough. Jennings does not make that mistake anymore. The male anchor who does not take Barbara Walters seriously enough is generally the male anchor who's just been scooped. Her friend Ted Koppel told me the other day, no one works harder. No one is a more intense and conscientious reporter. No doubt. I recall a visit to Washington in the late 1970s by Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin. I thought I had arranged an exclusive for CBS, but as I arranged at Blair House, I spotted Walters leaving. She had just got her exclusive. Walters has not only been a trailblazer in matters of gender, but also a trailblazer in matters of money. She was the first reporter, male or female, to earn $1 million a year. That was, by the way, back in 1976. She does much better now. My brother Bernard, also an admirer of Walters, asked me to pass on his gratitude tonight. Gratitude? I said, why? What for? Bernie cited a bit of political poetry from the Kennedy days, something about a rising tide lifting all ships. When she got her $1 million, my own salary went up $24, he said. The truth is, the salary of every reporter in television news, every reporter, skyrocketed after Walters switched networks and made $1 million. Now, 20 years later, network loyalty is seen as stodgy silliness, something from the distant past, and anchors routinely earn between $2.5 and $10 million a year, a fact that has transformed the values of the television news business and the status of many prominent reporters into that of celebrities, better known, more influential, obviously better paid than many of the people they interview. Finally, Walters has set new records in broadcast news for scoops. No one has so many firsts to her name. One of her first firsts, in fact, did not get on the air. Koppel told me that shortly after the Reasoner fiasco, Walters accompanied President Jimmy Carter to India, determined to prove her value to ABC and to the craft of journalism. And there she showed an early glimpse of her vaunted power to get important people to talk to her on a personal and exclusive basis. She got a one-on-one with India's Prime Minister, Morarji Desai. And what did this usually reserved, reticent politician disclose to Walters, in addition, of course, to all of India's secrets? That every morning he drank a vial of his own, well, let us say in this distinguished company, he drank a vial of an exotic beverage of a very personal flavor. Anyway, with this exclusive in hand, so to speak, Walters rushed back to the ABC office where she ran into Koppel and Sam Donaldson. She asked whether they thought she could use that part of the interview on the evening news. Their response is a stunning example of how times have changed from the late 1970s to now. No way, they both responded firmly. That's much too personal a flavor. Walters reluctantly agreed, but to her regret, weeks later, Dan Rather of 60 Minutes broke the same story. In 1979, Walters began to contribute her special brand of interview to the ABC News magazine 2020. Since 1984, she's been co-host with Hugh Downs of that program and solo host of dozens and dozens of special interview programs with presidents and movie stars, politicians and generals, and she's won just about every honor. She has also won a degree of criticism to the effect that as a journalist she should have been spending less time on Hollywood and more on serious subjects. The criticism, generally speaking, did not stick. Colleagues are struck by her energy and her fairness. I want to do good and tough interviews, she has said, but I don't want to kill anybody. They are also struck by her fierce competitiveness, her determination to be first with the most, even though, as she once told Newsweek magazine, she didn't think she had it in her to succeed in this business. I was the kind nobody thought could make it. I had a funny Boston accent. I couldn't pronounce my R's. I wasn't a beauty. And when the late comedienne Gilda Radner produced the Baba Wawa character on Saturday Night Live, Walters was, understandably for a time, devastated, until her own daughter, laughing at the skit, advised her to cool it. "Oh, Mother, lighten up," she said. Barbara Walters might have had what one critic, Tom Shells of the Post, called a bumpy ride to the pinnacle, but she has clearly reached it. Walters is a journalist and a superstar, a potent combination that is now testing and defining the outer limits of professionalism in the TV news business. She is without doubt one of our most widely known and admired broadcast journalists. She has broken the barriers and influenced the evolution of television news. And it gives me great pleasure on behalf of the Kennedy School and the Shorenstein Center to honor Barbara Walters with the Goldsmith Career Award for Excellence in Journalism.
Marvin did not kiss Peter Jennings or Ted Koppel or Mike Wallace or Don Hewitt when they won their award. Marvin, I think that is about the most thoughtful introduction, I mean it, that I've ever had. You really did your homework. When you talk about Harry Reasoner, it's still, you know, I'm supposed to make people cry. That can still bring tears to my eyes. And the other thing that makes me feel very sad is that I'm no longer called the Today Girl or the 2020 girl or whatever. Since Marvin talked about that interview with Maraja Desai, I'm going to tell you what happened afterwards. This is not part of my prepared script, and I will hate to see it on the internet. But this was when I fell in love with Sam Donaldson and Ted Koppel, because it was when I was working my way back after the disastrous year with Harry Reasoner, and I was doing general reporting, and we went off with Jimmy Carter in 1977, Sam Donaldson, Ted Koppel, who was in the State Department correspondent, Sam, White House correspondent, and I was doing general assignment. And Jimmy Carter went to Poland, Iran, and India. And in India, I did this interview with Maraja Desai, and he had what he called, I'm not as polite as Marvin, he did urine therapy, okay? And when we sat down, and he talked about the medicinal values of drinking it. And when we sat down for dinner that night in a small Indian restaurant, Sam, Ted, and myself, the waiter said, "Would you like to try the local wine?" And we said, we would be happy to. And so he came with the local wine, and he poured us each little glass, and Koppel picked it up and went, "It's a good urine. It's not a great urine, but it's a good urine." I hope that the rest of this evening goes uphill. I do want to say something about this award and how important it is, and how very much it means to me, not just because it is an award of excellence and because the people who have received it in the years past are people whom I admire so much, but it is interesting that this is called the Joan Shorenstein Center, named after a woman, and the Goldsmith Awards are named after a woman. And although Marvin said it had nothing at all to do with his choice, I'm happy that I'm the first woman to receive it. I'm also very happy to be back here in Boston. I was born and brought up here, and I should come back more often and improve my accent. There are two misconceptions that I would like to clear up before I begin. First of all, when I was invited, I was told that I would be staying at some place called the Charles Hotel. This came as a big surprise to me because in the light of certain events in Washington, I had assumed that I would be staying in Paul Revere's bedroom. The other misconception is that, although I'd be delighted to talk about it in the questions and answers, and I hope that we will have many of them, I will not be talking today about investigative journalism. Years ago, there was a song parody written, I believe, by an ex-alumni of Harvard named Tom Lehrer, and the song went, "If the rockets go up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department," said Werner von Braun. And investigative journalism is not exactly my department, although we have all been touched and involved with it, especially at ABC. I want to talk about something that I know a little bit more about, not from my own example, but from others, and that is leadership. in these days when there are such questions about leadership and what makes a leader, and there are all ways of being determined in a leader. I have my own little true story. When I was on the Today Show, so now that was going back more than 20 years, I used to live in an area in New York across the street from Carnegie Hall where there are a great many hotels, and on the corner were the ladies of the evening when I would leave at 4:30 or 5 a.m. And even then, 20 years ago, I wasn't exactly a kid, and I would come downstairs holding a little bag, and I would be wearing dark glasses because I was going to the studio to get made up, and I would get into this long black limousine and drive off. And they would look at me, and I gave them hope. So I would now like to discuss the qualities that inspire hope and leadership. I have been very fortunate in interviewing and meeting so many leaders in the 15 years on the Today Show and the 20 years at ABC. 12 different interviews with presidents, 20 different heads of state, some of the most powerful positions in their nations, and seeing them again out of power. The human side, and victory, and defeat, and exile. I remember interviewing the Shah of Iran when he said that his wife was not competent to rule. She was the regent, but women could not rule. And when he was ill and in exile in Morocco, and I did what was then almost the final interview with him, it was his wife who was taking care of it all. Yasser Arafat, I remember interviewing him in a bombed-out apartment building in Lebanon where we had to travel for over an hour under circuitous routes so that we would not be followed. And Yasser Arafat, now the leader of a new territory. Fidel Castro in 1977, we crossed the Bay of Pigs with him. We were the first Americans to cross the Bay of Pigs since the invasion, and he told me that Russia was the freest country in the world. And King Hussein, truly a survivor, whom I interviewed 5 times over 25 years. Well, what do they have in common? First of all, I think tremendous belief in themselves, belief in their mission, perhaps belief in a higher power. The Shah said that he had visions as a child that he would be born to be king. Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, fierce enemies, and then allies and supporters, were both deeply religious men. Each felt that God was on his side, but they prayed to 2 very different gods. Often, of course, a leader is something of a fanatic. Being too much of a fanatic can lead, of course, to despotism and dictatorship. And much of being a leader is the ability to communicate. Ronald Reagan had it, George Bush didn't, Bill Clinton does. But it is more than that. It's a combination of many things. And so I would like, if I may, to read from some of the interviews that I have done, exactly as they said it, on their definition of leadership. This is General Norman Schwarzkopf. This interview was done 3 weeks after the Gulf War ended. What I asked is your definition of leadership. He said, let me tell you what leadership is. Leadership is competence, but far more important, leadership is character. Leadership is taking charge and being willing to take the responsibility and then to do what's right because it is right. And that's what leadership is. After we had done the major part of our interview, we went back to his headquarters. He was living in what was the basement of, let's say, it was the Pentagon in Riyadh, a huge building, and he, as you know, is a great bear of a man. And he had his quarters were not very much larger than this area. There was a small room with a curtain that divided his desk from his bed, and then he had a CD player with some CDs of opera and classical music. And on his desk was a picture of his father and his children. And when I asked him about his father, who had been a general but hadn't risen to his class, his eyes teared up. And when we came back to finish the interview, I talked of this and said, the picture of generals don't cry. Generals don't get tears in their eyes. He said, sure they do. And I said, they just don't admit it? He said, oh, I think they admitted it. Grant, after Shiloh, went back and cried. Sherman went back and cried, and these are the tough old guys. Lee cried at the loss of human life, at the pressures that were brought to bear. Lincoln cried. And frankly, any man that doesn't cry scares me a little bit. I don't think I would like a man who is incapable of enough emotion to get tears in his eyes every now and then. That type of person scares me. That's not a human being, and that's not a leader. I think I have something for men in uniforms because I'm very fond of Colin Powell. I think this is a man with a great deal of character. I also don't think that he's going to run for president. And Dean Nye and I were talking at dinner. Dean Nye said it's like that Groucho Marx story. Any country club that wants me, I don't want to belong to. And I think our feeling is that anybody who wants badly enough to be president and has that kind of ambition shouldn't be president, which is why so many people admire Colin Powell. Colin Powell, for most of his early life, was, if not a failure, certainly very undistinguished, didn't do well in grammar school or high school, had no idea what he wanted to be until he entered college and found his way into the ROTC, and then everything came into place, he said. And when we did a very large profile of him 2 years ago, when his book came out, we were the first to do this interview with him and the profile. I said, when you were in the ROTC, you said that you knew you were a leader. What is leadership? And he said, leadership is the ability to motivate people to achieve objectives. Leadership, in my context, is the ability to solve problems. I think I'm a pretty good leader because I can solve problems. That's what I do, solve problems for others. It's my greatest skill. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't have views and visions of my own. And because I don't rant and rave and I tend to chip away at problems, people sometimes mistake my motive. I have been reasonably successful in getting what I want and achieving what I wanted to achieve here in Washington, or otherwise you, Barbara, would not be sitting here. Margaret Thatcher. Well, the word legend is overused, but Margaret Thatcher, certainly of our generations and our time, is a legend. I interviewed her from the beginning, really, from before she became Prime Minister. And you know, when you're with someone before they achieve their position of leadership, and you're with them in those days, they have perhaps a special feeling about you. So I did a great many interviews with Margaret Thatcher. This is from March of 1987. It was her father, by the way, who first introduced her to politics. He ran a grocery store, but he was also an alderman who had been defeated. He loved political life. He was the greatest influence in her life, and this is what she said he taught her. You never just go and do something because someone else is doing it. That is wrong. You never just follow the crowd for the sake of following the crowd because you don't like to stand up. You make up your own mind about what is right, and then you do what you wish. And then you try to persuade other people to follow you. It was quite a tough thing for a child to learn. It has stood me in very good stead since. And then her own party ousted her. Not her countrymen, but her party. While she was in France, they turned her out in a vote count. The first vote count was not definitive, and they had another vote count, and she left office. Perhaps she had too much hubris. There was not one member of her cabinet who was there from the original days. And perhaps she became too strong, too opinionated, too unable to listen to anyone else. Perhaps it was just time for a change. But she went into a deep depression. Politicians and leaders are also human. And I did the first interview with her. I keep saying I hate the first, but this was in 1991, the first interview after she was forced to leave office. She said, it's traumatic, it really is. You're so busy doing things, you don't realize it until you're out, and it comes in strange ways. Even now, when we're driving down Whitehall towards Westminster, or to go home, which is not very far away, all of a sudden my mind still thinks we'll turn right into Downing Street. And then I realize we're not going to. It's the habit of years which gets you. The telephone goes, and immediately you think, oh, goodness me, the United Nations is sitting, I wonder what's happening. And you'll hear something in the news in the morning, and you think, oh, we can't have that. I must inquire what's happening. We really must make a statement about it. I leap up to dial the telephone, and then I realize it's no longer me anymore. Remember this lesson. No matter how high up, how easy it is for the mighty to fall. It is interesting in news today that there is almost no foreign leader whom the American public has any desire to see. You see almost no of them on the television news programs or the television news magazines. Indeed, there's very little interest in foreign affairs at all, nor is there very much interest in seeing American politicians on prime-time news magazines, and perhaps we can talk about this later, and that is the softness of the news. But there was a time when we had very charismatic leaders. Maybe they're just not that interesting these days. But there was a time, especially in the Middle East, and Marvin talked about it, when you had giants like Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin and the Shah in his way. And I was very privileged at that time to do a great deal of reporting in the Middle East. And the man whom I cared about the most, when people say, oh, when you go back, who made the most impression or what's your favorite interview. It's almost impossible to think of it, but I would say Anwar Sadat. This was a man of enormous personality, of charisma and courage, and he changed that part of the world, and it is impossible to imagine the Middle East today without what he did, and the effects of what he did is still going on. I did so many interviews with him, and then I had the personal sadness of covering his funeral. It was very strange. The streets of Cairo were absolutely empty. Whether it was because people were not really in mourning or whether because they'd had enough of Sadat, it's impossible for me to say today. Like Yitzhak Rabin, he was murdered not by strangers, but by one of his own people, who felt, an Islamic fundamentalist, who felt that he was too westernized and who felt that he had to be eliminated. But even evidently at the moment of his death, he was able to give an answer. This is an interview that was done 1 year after his death with Jahan Sadat. Anwar Sadat was murdered in October in the celebration of what the Egyptians call the October War and the Israelis call the Yom Kippur War. It was not a victory for the Egyptians, but they considered it so, and they celebrated it. And there was a big parade, and tanks and armored cars came out, and from one of these trucks came the men in uniform who walked up to Sadat and murdered him. And he stood up. As they came towards him, he stood up. And I said to Jahan Sadat, "Do you understand why he stood up?" And she said, "That is Anwar Sadat. He didn't bow, he didn't bend, he didn't go under the chair, he stood and just put up his hand and he said no." She said, "Of course, I didn't hear him because of the planes, but I was attending and I saw him, he stood up." And I said, "How do you know?" He said, "No." And she said, "Our President Mubarak told me that." And I said, "That was his last word?" And she said, "Yes, that was his last word." And I said, "So he knew it was happening?" And she said, "I am sure because, Barbara, he is a military man. If he stands up to shake hands with anybody, he must put his cap on his head. His cap was in front of him, and he stood without his cap, and he put his hand up and he said, 'No.' It means that he knew that this was treason." I talked earlier of the belief in a divine mission, and when Sadat went to Israel, he was called a traitor by the other Arab nations and shunned by them. His own foreign minister resigned the day he decided that he would go to Israel. It was a foreign minister who, by the way, had arranged for me to do the very first interview that I had done with Sadat. He never wore a bulletproof vest, and when I had asked him in an interview if he was fearful, he said, "I won't die one day sooner than when I am called." This also from the interview with Mrs. Sadat. Something very strange that he told my son, who was in the United States when he died. Just 2 days before he died, my son was leaving, and he said goodbye to his father. But when he was leaving the room, his father called him again, "Gamal, Gamal, are you going to stay in the United States for long?" He said, "No, Father, only 10 days. And his father said, "Well, if you can, hurry more than that. Be quick here. Come back so quickly." And my son said, "All right, Father, I will do my best." And his father said, "You are a grown-up. You are a man now. I can depend on you." And my son laughed, and he said, "Yes, Father." And his father said, "Take care of your mother." Those were his last words. And my son, he said, "Yes, Father." And he left. There are all kinds of leaders. You don't have to be in politics to be a leader. You don't have to be a head of state. You don't have to be on television. You can be a man paralyzed from the neck down. You can be a man named Christopher Reeve. We did the first interview that Christopher Reeve did after his accident a year ago, September. At the time, I think our audience was very concerned about this. It was a huge audience, but they turned out in the beginning out of sort of a ghoulish curiosity to see what was he going to look like. Was this going to be like someone out of an Edgar Allan Poe story? And they stayed for an hour. We did an hour with this man because what he had to say was so extraordinary. And he was not a man easy to listen to because, as you know, he speaks through a respirator. So he has to talk. Only when he gets a breath, he talks like this, and then as his lungs and the air runs out, he has to stop. And then take another breath. This is September 29th, 1995. You also gradually discover, as I am discovering, that your body is not you, and the mind and the spirit must take over. And that's the challenge as you move from obsessing about why me, and it's not fair, and when will I move again, and move into, well, what is the potential? And now I see opportunities and potential I wasn't capable of seeing, because every moment is more intense and valuable than it ever was. I have received more than 100,000 letters from all over the world, and it makes you wonder, why do we need disasters to really feel and appreciate each other? I'm overwhelmed by people's support of me, and if I can help people understand that this can happen to anybody, then it's worth it right there. I said, do you think you will walk again? He said, I think it's very possible I'll walk again. And if you don't, then I won't walk again. As simple as that. Either you do or you don't. It's like a game of cards. And if you think the game is worthwhile, then you just play the hand you're dealt. Sometimes you get a lot of face cards, and sometimes you don't. But I think the game is worthwhile. I really do. And so will he walk again? Well, up until recently, there was very little experimentation in spinal cord injuries because it was considered so hopeless that there were very few researchers. And now research is being done all over the world in spinal cord injuries, in great part funded by the American Paralysis Association, and Christopher Reeve has been their spokesman and their guiding spirit, and the money has come in since his accident. He has spoken as often as he can and in as many places as he can. I just received a Harvard medical letter this morning, and it said that one of the top 10 medical advances of 1996 has been repairing severed spinal cords. It said researchers in Sweden have been able to regenerate spinal cords in rats by grafting healthy nerve fibers across the injured section of a rat's spinal cord using a special growth-stimulating glue. And rats who had been paralyzed could now walk on their hind legs. I talked to Christopher Reeve 2 days ago, and he told me that there is also another team in Switzerland that has found a protein inhibitor which could connect the brain to the damaged nerves in the spine, again, funded by the American Paralysis Association. Christopher Reeve is very busy these days editing a film that he directed, and he is about to act in another film. He is playing his cards, and this is his leadership. So I could hope that all of you today get a great deck of cards in your life, and that you use them for much more than playing solitaire. I thank you.
Thank you. You could find us an angel who would give us better ones.
I'll try to do that kind of leadership and get it for you.
We have time for some questions, and there are microphones here. So those of you who want to ask a question, come to the microphone, identify yourself, and ask a question. Don't make a speech. Go right ahead.
Hi, and welcome to Harvard University. Barbara Walters, I must say that you have educated my mind for many years, and I just want to thank you and congratulations on receiving the Goldsmith Award. You very much deserve it. My name is Lisa Bensfeld, and I have a live cable TV talk show here in the city of Cambridge called Be Live with Lisa B. But the question I would like to ask you is, what has been your most difficult and challenging what has been the most difficult and challenging interview that you have conducted over the past many, many years?
Well, I think it's very hard for any of us to think of the number one or the most difficult or the easiest or the rudest or the this or that. You do so many. So I'm going to do what politicians do and answer not what you asked, but what is the most difficult part of my job today. And I think it's twofold. One is the enormous competition between programs, a kind of cutthroat competition that we all face because the name of the game more than ever before is ratings, and the high-impact interviews are the ones that get the highest ratings. And I think the other thing that we are finding difficult today is the lack of interest on the part of, I guess, the public, and therefore reflected by the news programs, or maybe it's the other way around, maybe we influence them, so that we are doing fewer and fewer of the kind of interviews that most of us want to do, which is the so-called hard news interviews and the political interviews. So that would be, I can't tell you what was my most difficult. I can only tell you what the difficulties are that face us right now.
I see. Also, I'd like to know what advice you have for aspiring women in the journalism field today. And also, I'd like to know if you would sign my thesis. I graduated from Harvard, and I obtained my master's in the field in concentrating in government, and I was wondering if you could sign my thesis.
Well, you'll have no trouble, because you obviously have a great deal of confidence and assertiveness. You're going to make it. I would be happy to sign that if we have time. I have to make a plane and get back tonight, so I'll do my best to sign. But my advice for female journalists is what my advice for male journalists it would be, and that is get your foot in the door. Get your foot in the door any way you can. And don't worry about having to, I don't think, make the coffee or bring the water. I do it with my assistants, they do it with me. The only day I refuse to wash the dishes, because we have a little kitchen, is Fridays, because it spatters all over what I'm wearing in the air. Other than that, we alternate. Get your foot in the door, and if you want to be in any form of journalism, I think you're best starting with your local paper or your local news program or your cable news program, but just do anything. Don't worry about the hours. And if you get there earliest and work hardest and do your homework, there's no reason why you couldn't make it. Today, there is no difference between women and men being hired. So you shouldn't ask about a woman journalist, just ask about a journalist.
All right, thank you.
Yes, please.
My name is John Frank, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. Tonight you talked about leadership, and I was wondering if you think that television actually has changed leadership to some degree. And I ask that because I think of Lenin, who was not the best looking man in the world, and also very, very dynamic. And I know that for Clinton, he was always told not to use his hands when he was talking to the television, to be very, very calm. So I was wondering if television then really has changed what leaders from the past really couldn't be leaders today.
Oh, sure. I mean, you have to be good on television. I mean, Bob Dole may have been a very wise man, and he may have been a very good president, but he was not a very good candidate, and he was terrible on television. Bill Clinton is certainly better in terms of his personality. He knows how to use the cameras. Lyndon Johnson was terrible on camera. The most forceful personality of a president we probably had in this the last 50 years, but he was uncomfortable with teleprompter. His voice boomed. He did not know how to use the communication. It's too bad. You have to be very personable these days in order to get elected. The other thing that we know now more than ever before is how much buying television ads matters. I mean, we know this from Richard Morris' book of hearing about how Clinton bought television ads in every small town in the country. We know it now with all of the money that's been raised. The name of the game is buying the ads on television. You got enough money, it looks as if you win the election. So television has had an enormous impact, and we worry about it. And that's why in the last election, there were all these different things. Should we give free time? Should we give 5 minutes? Should we give 10 minutes? What about the debates? The debates this year were very unimportant. They played very little part in it. But television, at least in the network news, is aware of its responsibility, and we're still trying to figure out how we can help or how we exert it. The other thing is, again, that in general, and when I'm talking about the network programs, they are simply not interested in seeing politicians. They are interested in what affects their own life. They are not interested in what affects their day-to-day life. And they are not interested in the political figures. Unless there's a crisis, then we're always interested. Give us a crisis, we'll be right there.
Okay, thanks.
You do identify yourself, too.
Sure. My name is Jared Genzer. I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School, and I want to thank you very much for coming this evening. I've really enjoyed your speech. My question is that, given the trends in journalism over the last 10 or 15 years, television journalism, to focus on more sort of a soundbite mentality, for tabloid television to really become much more popular, some of the daily talk shows, et cetera. I'm curious as to where you see the future of television broadcasting. Obviously, things have moved in the direction of much shorter stories, much more catchy stories, stories that kind of blend entertainment with news. And I'm curious as to where you see that going.
Well, that is true, and it is a dominant theme today. But many of the stories are being done in greater length. They're just softer stories. If you watch the 3 network news programs, there's less and less time on the so-called hard news, and there are more and more features. What do you do with your money? What do you do with your health? What do you do with your children? What do you do with drugs? They're becoming, as we have cable, which deals more with the hard news. If you are interested in the news, you can find it in cable if you have cable. But there are tremendous, we keep hearing that deplored, and there are more and more articles now about the softness of news. But there are also very exciting things that are happening in television, and I really am not up to date as much as I should be on the latest developments. But you can have no more secret wars, because we can get television cameras into anything. And it's not just that we have faxes, we have satellites. There's no place you can't go. We will see in the not too distant future the kind of thing that you and I never had. I mean, I'm talking about these big microphones, but you and I had to travel around with camera crews and lighting crews and audio crews, and you will be able to wear a hat or wear a little lapel pin and have your camera and your lights and your audio, and you'll be able to go into any tunnel in any place. The reporter will be his own cameraman and his own lighting director and his own audio man and his own producer, and there will be no part of the world in which you can't go. It is a world that is coming closer and closer together at the same time that we are less and less interested, in general, in what is happening in the rest of the world.
Our colleague Barry Dunsmore raised the question about whether the next war is going to be a live war. What do you think?
A live war?
Live.
You mean whether we'll be able to cover it? Yeah. Well, we tried to in the Gulf War. Yes, I would think that we would be able to, and if you can do it the way a print reporter can go, because a print reporter can take out his little book and, just television has not been able to do that with all the stuff we've been able to but have to carry around. If you can just carry this little microphone, light, this and that, yes, it will.
If you were Roone Arledge and the head of ABC, would you make a command decision to cover it live if you had the technological capability, or would you say, I've got the ability, but I won't cover it live?
Well, this is the problem that we faced in the Gulf War between what the government says. I mean, are you going to be a patriot and you're going to help your country, or are you going to be a reporter and get it on the air? And it is a very difficult decision, and most reporters say, I love my country, but I'm going to get it on the air. I just want to say one thing. I just came back last week from Singapore, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and in Singapore I'm watching MSNBC, and in Cambodia I'm seeing CNN. So, I mean, that is the exciting part.
The world is wired. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Jim Snyder. I'm a doctoral student at Northwestern and one of the recipients of a Goldsmith Research Award. I have 3 related questions. First,
try one, because we've got a few other people.
They're closely related. First, do you feel comfortable with the intense political activity of your bosses? The CEO of ABC and the other major networks have repeatedly lobbied the President of the United States and the senior members of Congress on a number of issues, for example, the spectrum allocation to broadcasters. Second, and closely related to that, the major elite media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Columbia Journalism Review, have repeatedly accused the major TV networks of avoiding this issue. Do you attribute that? This is the spectrum allocation to broadcasters,
you're talking about something I know very little about. I do not know what Roone Arledge and others have been lobbying Congress or the President about. I can only tell you whenever we've had to lobby about anything, we've seemed to have failed. And in terms of publications like the Columbia School of Journalism and so forth, and they are superb, but it's very easy to attack the large network. We are a great target. But I really don't have I'd like to tell you that I know everything about everything, but I don't know about that. One day give this award to Roone and he'll put him on the spot.
We may. We've got a lot of people wanting to ask questions. We got 5 minutes because Ms. Walters has to catch a 10 o'clock flight back to New York. Please.
Hi, my name is Grace Lee. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I was just wondering, this is sort of a general question, but what is it that you're most proud of?
Oh, what are you most proud of? I have a daughter. You know, most of the women of my generation didn't have children because it was too tough to do everything. I mean, Connie Chung, whom I have enormous admiration for, did not have a child until she left CBS, and we were talking about it today and about her having the time to be with that child. I have a daughter who is 28 years old, and it's very different today because you can bring your, if I brought my daughter in when I was on the Today Show when she was a baby, it would have been like bringing in a puppy that wasn't housebroken. Today there is not enough understanding, and we don't have daycare centers, but there is a lot more. And so you can, you know, you can bring your child in and nobody says, you know, what are you doing? You can be on the air when you're pregnant. When I began, you couldn't be on the air when you were pregnant. I mean, they couldn't just shoot you from here. It was just considered sort of disgusting to be sitting there and to be pregnant. So I guess the things that you're proudest of, am I proud of my career? Yeah. I've worked very hard, and it has wonderful rewards like this. But what I'm proudest of, I guess, is that I have a daughter whom I love and like, and that she feels the same way about me, I hope.
Come on, Mother, lighten up.
Yeah, lighten up. She was also a brat. She was also impossible. Yeah, I forgot all that.
Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Cindy Arenberg, and I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. And I'd like to thank you for your remarks, which I found both inspirational and quite moving. Thank you very much. My question is, Professor Kalb mentioned the increase in salaries that's taken place. Mm-hmm. And James Fallows cites that as one of the problems today with journalism, the rising salaries and speaking fees and how that might compromise the journalist's perspective. And I wondered if you would comment on that.
Let me say several things. First of all, you will always find that the print journalist is the one who criticizes the television salaries until he or she gets into television. We all get paid an enormous amount. When I came to ABC 20 years ago, I got $1 million. What nobody said was that it was $500,000 for the news and $500,000 for doing 4 primetime specials a year. I have, by the way, a special on next Monday preceding the Academy Awards. It shouldn't be a total loss. I hope you'll all watch. So that I
always do
that in addition. I sat the other night next to a very high executive at NBC who told me that Bryant Gumbel was going to get a salary that was so unbelievable that all of us were going to walk in again and ask for raises. The figure that CBS has given is $5 million. The figure that we have heard bandied about is after he does his syndication and this and that, that'll be near $12 or $13 million. If that's the case, I'm going in tomorrow to ask for a raise. Sure, we are overpaid, but you know, well, we are overpaid if you compare us to a president. We're overpaid if you compare us to any of you. We're overpaid if you compare us to Marvin. Marvin could make a lot more in television. But our companies are not charitable. Our companies are not charitable organizations. And the news magazines, for example, make a huge amount of money. And they're not giving this to us because they just think that we're so nice. They're giving it to us because we make this kind of money. We bring in these kinds of ratings. We don't begin to make what the entertainment stars make. Now again, this makes us celebrities. This leads in some degree to the softening of the news and the having to keep the ratings up and so on. But you know, it's what the market will allow. And I am very grateful that I'm making this kind of money. On the other hand, my first year at ABC, when I was making that $1 million, was the most miserable year of my life. And it is more important to me to do work that I like. You know, we used to say that we would work for nothing. And I probably would, although it's the last thing that I want Michael Eisner to hear.
Thank you.
We're out of time because I want to make sure that she gets the 10 o'clock flight. Tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the Malkin penthouse upstairs here on the 4th floor, we're going to bring together all of the finalists for the Prize for Investigative Reporting and have a discussion about the present and future of investigative reporting, because it is under assault, but it still lives on very happily, I think. It should be extremely interesting. You're all welcome to come. I want to say a special thanks to Michelle Johnson, who was there in the shadows. Michelle, come on out. Come on, come on. Thank you. It is extremely difficult to put together this kind of complicated set of prizes. And she does it each year with such skill and grace and dedication. There's never a stitch missed, and I am grateful as hell. Thank you, Michelle, very much. And finally, I have to ask Barbara Walters a question, because we've been praising her as a very good reporter. Now, I'm going to make a statement that right here on the stage is a piece of furniture that you own. Have you any idea what it
Piece
may
of
be?
furniture that I own on the stage? That you're giving to me or that I already own?
Take this.
Do I now own this?
Well, no, you don't own this. You don't own this at all, but I'm going to give you a chance to move around just for a bit and see whether you can figure out. You just dropped an earring.
I own that. No, I can't.
You own the earring.
You own the earring.
All right, I'll make it easy for you. Look around the back of your chair. This is a very special.
Award for Excellence in Journalism. Barbara Walters, March 18th, 1997. The Joan Shorenstein Center in the Press, Politics, and Public Policy.
Not
Oh,
bad.
my.
Not bad.
But I want to congratulate all of you, and I want to tell you that we at ABC and all of the news departments and all of the network news departments are grateful for your work, are concerned about the state of investigative journalism, and the fact that the jury that voted against ABC was not because of hidden cameras, but because supposedly the reporters were taking positions in the company under false pretenses. I don't know how you do it otherwise. You can't just walk in and say, I'd like to do an expose on you. And it is something of deep concern to all of us, and it is to the betterment of all of us that there are people like you who are doing the kind of work you're doing, and I congratulate you. We're very grateful.
I'm States